Just before she died, my grandmother gave me a strange necklace. She made me promise to never take it off. I don't need this superstitious crap, I wanted to say. I don't even believe in God. Even so, I leaned forward so that Grandma Eliza could slip the cross necklace over my head with trembling hands. "Never take it off," she gasped, barely able to form words. Her mouth kept opening and closing, fish-like, but I couldn't decipher the word she repeated over and over. It sounded like, "Itchath." But that didn't make any sense. It wasn't even a real word. Still, I nodded, and that seemed to satisfy her. Her hand dropped from my cheek. She let out a ragged breath and turned her face toward the bright garden outside her cabin window. A few seconds later, I witnessed death for the first time. I was 15 years old. Grandma Eliza's white wood cross necklace clashed with my all-black goth wardrobe, but I wore it anyway. About half the people in Grandma's village wore those necklaces too, and I needed to do everything I could to fit in, because Grandma Eliza's village was about to become my new home. My parents told me we were moving just a few hours after Grandma's death. Later, I overheard the whole, true story from the gossips in the village bar. A few weeks before Grandma Eliza died, my father knew for sure that his dry cleaning business was going bankrupt. We were going to lose the big city apartment, the car, everything. My father hadn't visited Grandma Eliza in over 6 years, and he hadn't brought us to her deathbed out of love or compassion. We'd come back to Grandma's village because we had nowhere else to go. My new classmates knew all this and more. It was like they knew more about my own family than I did. I learned about the mysterious, explosive argument that had caused my father to leave town whenever he was around my age. I learned that my ancestors had once been wealthy landowners, but had lost everything overnight when Grandma was just a little girl. I felt a tightness in my chest as I understood the true reason why Grandma Eliza had lived such a frugal, self-sufficient life. She simply hadn't wanted her family to starve again. The more I learned about my family history, the more false and hollow my life began to feel. Sometimes, the only thing that felt real anymore was a little wooden cross around my neck. Even if it hadn't been for all those uncomfortable revelations, I soon discovered that life in Grandma's village wasn't what I'd remembered from childhood. Back then, I didn't need much more entertainment than splashing in the cool, shady creek behind Grandma's house or catching weird bugs in her garden. As a teenager, though, the village was boring as hell. People knew so much about me, I discovered, because there was absolutely nothing to do in Grandma's village except gossip, stir up drama, and tell tall tales. I understood why Grandma Eliza had spent so much time talking to her sheep, her chickens, and even her tomatoes. They were probably the only sane conversation partners in the whole village. Since my parents had sold most of Grandma's animals, I wound up hanging out with Luca, a local footballer, and a true asshole. Luca had a sarcastic comment or hurtful joke for everyone who crossed his path, and I was no exception. Even his own football team wanted to get rid of him, but couldn't because he was the best midfielder in town. Luca treated me like shit, making fun of my big city obsessions like obscure bands and good coffee, but then Luca treated everyone like shit. In fact, he was the only person in the village who didn't treat me differently for having been born someplace else. I soon realized that Luca was actually a kind and sensitive person. Being an asshole was just his way of dealing with life in the village, of dealing with the fact that he was a not too smart, not too handsome guy from an unimportant corner of planet Earth. "The past is gone, the present is garbage, and the future is doomed," Luca used to say. Then I'd tell him that he was clearly a poet at heart. He'd tell me to go fuck myself, and we'd kick the ball around a little more. 2 years passed like that, playing football in marshy football pitch beside the town dump, drinking grain alcohol from bottles left behind by Luca's booze-hound relatives, and taking endless walks through the forested valleys around the village. There was one path, however, that we never took. It didn't look any different from the others, just a narrow dirt path that led up one side of a rocky stream that trickled down from the distant hills, but Luca absolutely refused to set foot in it. "We don't go that way," Luca told me simply when I asked. "It's tradition." I laughed. Respect for tradition hadn't stopped Luca from drunkenly pissing on the door of the village's ancient church, and now I was supposed to believe it was stopping him from going down a trail? My blood ran cold when Luca told me the name of the trail. They call it the Witch Path. Witch Path. Witch Path. Witch Path. My grandmother's dying words. According to Luca, all the townspeople crossed the street whenever they approached, and not even stray dogs went near the trailhead. So why did the Witch Path look so clean and well-traveled? We were 16 that summer, and Luca and I didn't have much time left to solve the mystery. Soon I'd be preparing for college, while Luca would begin work in a machine shop a few towns over. It wasn't what he wanted, but with his grades and work ethic, it was the best he was likely to get, and he knew it. Our walks turned into long therapy sessions in which I tried, and failed, to save my friend from a spiral into alcoholism and depression. Just when I thought that Luca was at his lowest point, he said something that surprised me. We were on one of our night walks. Our bottle of stolen liquor was almost empty, and we were passing the unmarked trailhead of the Witch Path when my friend declared, "You know what? Fuck it. I want to see where it goes." I could hardly say no, and yet... The few rumors about the Witch Path that had filtered down to me were disturbing, to say the least. According to one rumor, some foreign cult had formed a self-sufficient commune down there, and folks who got too close to their compound were never seen again. Another stated that anyone who walked down the Witch Path fell horribly ill soon after, not because of a curse, but rather because there were so many ticks in the bushes along it that any traveler who walked down it was virtually guaranteed to get Lyme disease. The oldest tale stated that a woman lived in a hut near the headwaters of the stream, a woman who had been there long before the village and would be there long after. She could grant wishes and bestow magic gifts, but no one who went down that path came back the same. "You don't have to come, you know," Luca reminded me. "In fact, you probably shouldn't." The Witch Path glowed silver in the moonlight. As I set my foot onto it, I'd felt I'd crossed a frontier from which there was no going back. The trail wound uphill through a narrow gorge where the night air was cool and smelled like wet rocks. Luca and I were used to hearing a sudden, frightening animal noises during our night walks, but on that trail, the only sound was the wind in the trees. Luca didn't say a word. He only trudged determinately on, like a pilgrim eager for his journey's end. I, too, avoided breaking the silence. It felt like we were being listened to. Halfway up the trail, my heart leapt up into my throat when an enormous owl took flight up ahead. I wasn't superstitious, but it felt like an omen. My hand had unconsciously moved to Grandma Eliza's necklace. We walked for what felt like forever. The hills, valleys, and tiny villages spread out like a crumpled blanket below us, looking unfamiliar and haunted in the moon's silver glow. It could have been 1,000 years earlier or later. Luca and I could have been the last people on Earth, and we wouldn't have known it. "I never knew all this was up here," Luca whispered. "Incredible." "I guess the witch enjoys a good view," I joked. I was just glad that Luca was seeing the beauty in anything again. Tall grasses, only occasionally broken by bone-white rocks, covered these bald hilltops. The trail disappeared, but the way was clear enough, ever upward, where the hills met and the stream was born. It should have ended there. We should have taken in the gorgeous views, felt renewed by the night air, walked back to town, and gone on with our lives. But we didn't. A grove of trees grew in the shadows of the cliffs. In front of it, an ancient-looking but well-kept hut cast its shadow over a vast, fruitful garden. One part of the rumor, at least, was true. Someone was living up here. Whoever they were, I doubted that they'd take kindly to trespassers. I opened my mouth to whisper to Luca that we should turn back, but he'd gotten far ahead of me. I crept after him into the gloom alongside the garden fence. Water trickled up ahead. We had reached the spring where the stream began, the end of the witch path. And that's where we met her. She hummed a hauntingly beautiful tune as she dried her hair beside the moonlit pool. She'd been bathing in the spring, and silver water droplets glistened on her bare skin. My stomach knotted with the uneasy feeling that we were seeing something forbidden. I grabbed Luca's collar and tried to drag him back down the trail, but he dug his heels in like a stubborn mule. The woman glanced over her shoulder. There was no way she could have seen us, and yet she somehow made eye contact with us and winked. "Are you going to stand there and stare all night, or will you come by and say hello?" the woman asked. Luca managed to make some sort of dry gulping noise with his throat. "It's late, but I don't get many visitors up here. Why don't you come inside and have some tea?" The woman turned to us and smiled. With a damp sash wrapped around her, she was somehow even more enchanting than she'd been when she was completely nude. I'd expected dead-eyed cultists or a mad old hag, not a beautiful, funny, self-sufficient young woman who looked to be just a few years older than Luca and I. When she stopped to pick some tomatoes from her lush garden, she twisted them off the vine with an expertise that rivaled my grandmother's. As she led us through the garden, she explained that the villagers spread rumors about her because they were so closed-minded and set in their ways. Luca and I could definitely sympathize. "If you ventured up here, it's because you're different." The woman lit a candle as we stepped inside the hut, although I never saw her strike a match. "You understand that the point of being alive is to do what you want, not to do what you're told." Luca nodded, his eyes following the woman's every movement, but I was uncomfortable. The night air had been cool, but it was oppressively hot and humid inside the woman's hut. Grandma's cross began to itch. It felt heavy and abrasive beneath my shirt. I longed to take it off. "Your tea is ready." We all toasted. I took a deep sip. Why was it daylight outside? I wondered vaguely. Luca was an unmoving, backlit lump beside me. I tried to speak to him, but I couldn't move my lips, or any other part of my body, I realized. His face looked somehow blurry. I could hear the woman speaking, rustling around in the dim interior of the hut. She continued to speak, but it was like I was hearing two conversations, one superimposed over the other. In the first, the voice of the young woman was telling me everything I wanted to hear about myself, my future, even my relationship with my family, things she couldn't possibly have known. My head nodded along helplessly. In the second, a guttural, dusty voice growled something very different.
"Willful one, ain't you, dearie? No matter. I'll break you like all the rest. But I tire. Oh, how I tire of waiting when your flesh is so tender."
She reached out a hand, or was it a claw, for my face. Grandma Eliza's necklace exploded. I realized that it was not the wooden cross that mattered, but rather a symbol that my grandmother had carved into the back of it, a glyph that was now burning on my chest with a purplish-white flame. In its glow, I saw Luca's skin drying on the wall. His features had looked so strange and blurry because his face was gone. Luca's eyes, tongue, and innards were preserved in jars along the wall, along with those of many others. The woman, or the thing underneath the woman, shrieked. Its false appearance had been blasted away by the symbol's purifying light. The thing that hissed at me from the darkness was huge, hideous, and old beyond reckoning. The reek of the place hit me all at once, overpowering herbs, strange fungi, rotting flesh. I backed away toward the door, leaving Luca's red raw corpse behind. The symbol on my chest began to flicker. Grandma's magic, or whatever it was, had almost run its course. I scrambled out into the woman's garden, dodging the vines that reached out for my feet, the leaves that whipped across my face. A shriek of rage followed me as I fled. By the time I reached the village, the symbol's glow had faded. The only proof that any of it had happened were the burn marks where Grandma Eliza's necklace had been. As I watched the sun rise over the sleepy village, I knew that my grandmother's gift had saved my life.